Welcome back to 4547blog.com presents the New Conservative Radio Show. I'm your host, NINJ, and today we're going to reset the frame because if you're consuming these stories the way legacy media wants you to, you're being led in the wrong direction from the very start, per the norm nowadays. Big surprise, right? Today isn't about disconnected headlines, it's not about isolated incidents, and it's definitely not about the chaos from the left. What we're talking about today is contrast, the difference between competence and collapse, discipline and disorder, authority and absolute surrender. We're going to start in Venezuela, where the United States executed a precise, intelligence-driven operation that removed Nicolás Maduro without invasion, without occupation, and without a big old spectacle. It was a lawful, disciplined action carried out exactly the way modern power is supposed to be applied: quiet, controlled, decisive, according to an on-the-ground security guard's account. Cross-referenced with technical analysis from Mike Netter and his piece on X, this operation unfolded by design, not chance. Systems failed before resistance could even form. Communications collapsed. Command, it was disintegrated. Not because of chaos, but because of preparation and possibly some secret technology. Then I'm going to get into Minneapolis, Minnesota, and the ICE operation that didn't collapse because of incompetence on the ground. It collapsed because of institutions above and around it folded. Before facts were established, before investigations began, before legal standards were even explained, the verdict was already written. ICE was condemned. Federal authority was, delegitimized, as it's been for months, and the outrage of the left was activated. The barricades went up, the police stepped back as usual. Protest schedules appeared online and on television. The narrative hardened instantly. Enforcement is evil, resistance is righteous, and order is optional. The Nazi word getting thrown around again. That response isn't spontaneous. It's conditioned, and it's been conditioned for years, and we've all watched it. And here's where the media comes in, because the streets are not where the movement begins. It's where it finishes. The real coordination happens earlier, inside the newsroom, where major media outlets push protest times, locations, routes, slogans like "No Kings," organizer quotes again, "No Kings." They aren't reporting unrest. They're operationalizing it. They're working against America. They're turning activism into the infrastructure of their movement. That's not journalism, that's preparation, and we all know it. So today we're going to talk about all of it. The disciplined use of power in Venezuela, the institutional collapse at home, the role liberal media plays as the front lines of narrative control and mobilization for the liberal left. We're going to ask who benefits, who's accountable, and why rewarding chaos guarantees more of it. This is the New Conservative Radio Show with NINJ. Let's go. In a New York Post article and an interview, a Venezuelan security guard described how American forces wiped out hundreds of fighters without losing a single soldier, using technology unlike anything he has ever seen or heard. "We were on guard, but suddenly all of our radar systems shut down without any explanation," the guard said. "The next thing we saw were drones, a lot of drones, flying over our positions. We didn't know how to react. Moments later, a handful of helicopters appeared, barely 8 by his count, deploying what he estimated were just 20 U.S. troops into the area. But those few men," he said, "came armed with something far more powerful than guns. They were technologically very advanced," the guard recalled. "They didn't look like anything we've fought against before. What ensued," he said, "was not a battle, but a slaughter. We were hundreds, but we had no chance," he said. "They were shooting with such precision and speed it felt like each soldier was firing 300 rounds per minute. Then came the weapon that still haunts him. At one point, they launched something. I don't know how to describe it," he said. "It was like a very intense sound wave. Suddenly, it felt like my head was exploding from the inside. The effects were immediate and horrific. We all started bleeding from the nose," he said. "Some of us were vomiting blood. We fell to the ground, unable to move. We couldn't even stand up after that sonic weapon, or whatever it was." An estimated 100 Venezuelan security forces were killed in the January 3rd attack, according to the country's interior ministry. It is unclear if any of those were caused by the mystery weapon the security guard describes in his testimony. The unmatched defenders were helpless as the small U.S. Unit wiped them out, the guard said. "Those 20 men, without a single casualty, killed hundreds of us," he claimed. "We had no way to compete with their technology, with their weapons. I swear I've never seen anything like it." So let's start at the beginning because this didn't unfold the way legacy media wants you to picture it. I know it's surprising, but bear with me. What we just heard isn't spin from Washington or, slogans from activists. It's an inside account from a Venezuelan security guard who was there the night Nicolás Maduro was taken. And when you line that account up with the technical analysis from Mike Netter in his post on X, it's easy to see this was a deliberate engineered collapse, not chaos. According to the guard, the first thing that happened wasn't gunfire, it wasn't shouting, it wasn't explosions, it was silence. The radios went dead, the command channels cut out, radar screens went dark, almost simultaneously. Not one system failing, but all of them. And that matters because when defenders think they're dealing with a malfunction instead of an attack, precious minutes disappear. That's not accidental, that's by design of the U.S. Special Forces. Netter explains this phase in detail. Modern U.S. Special operations don't announce themselves. They blind and they deafen first. They hit communications and command and control so defenders can't orient themselves. They can't coordinate. They can't even agree on what's happening. And that's exactly what the guard described, confusion before the contact. Then the second phase, the drones. They were quiet, they were fast, they were overhead, they weren't buzzing toys, they were persistent eyes in the sky. The guard said they appeared before the helicopters, before ground movement. That tells you something real important. We already owned the battlefield before boots even touched the ground. Netter was clear on this too. Drones aren't just surveillance, they're dominance. They feed live intelligence, map movement, identify choke points, and let operators move with confidence. And that's why the guard put it like, he said the attackers, they didn't hesitate. They didn't probe. They went directly to the key positions like they had been there before. This is where the myth breaks. Hundreds of defenders, a handful of operators, and a large force never even organized. Why? Because size doesn't matter when you control information, timing, and momentum. The guard described the defenders shouting conflicting orders, trying to regroup, trying to understand where the threat was even coming from, while the attackers, us, United States, moved. Every step was planned. They moved like they knew where they were going. That's not bravery versus cowardice. It's preparation versus, paralysis on purpose. This is where the guard's account gets cool and interesting to me, and where Mike Netter's analysis really matters on this, event. Once U.S. operators moved in, the guard said something critical. Defenders just didn't lose the fight. They lost their senses, and they freaking hit the ground. People were disoriented, their ears were ringing, their vision was blurred. The panic spread faster than commands could. Units couldn't even tell who was firing from where, or even who was still in charge. Some defenders believed unfamiliar weapons were being used because what they were experiencing didn't match anything they had trained for or had ever experienced. What was it, Was it a sonic weapon? Was it secret tech? Netter explains that when electronic warfare like flash suppression or concussive force, precision fire, and rapid maneuver all hit at once, the human brain fills in the gaps. The body reacts before the mind can process all this information at once. So speed was the biggest weapon in this operation for the United States, and we know that. Our special operators train on speed constantly. And according to this guard, every attempt to respond was already too late. Defense positions were neutralized before anyone could coordinate a counterattack. The United States didn't spray fire. They selected targets. They suppressed movement and kept pressure constant. That's not brute force, That's discipline. That's the United States Special Forces. Don't mess with us. Netter pointed out that this intentional modern Special Forces operation was designed to overwhelm the decision-making, not just, the defenses. When you can't think, you can't fight. And the psychological effect matters just as much as the physical one. The guard said morale collapsed almost instantly, and that was exactly the intent. Not because the defenders were cowards, well, maybe some of them, but because they realized something terrifying. The U.S. was always ahead. Every move was anticipated, every position was exposed, every reaction was predicted. That's when panic sets in. That's when defenders stopped acting like a unit and start acting as, individuals trying to survive instead of fight. And while all this is happening, the time is compressing. The guard said the engagement felt both endless and impossibly short. Minutes stretch into something surreal, and then suddenly it was just over. Which brings me to the most important part. The United States didn't stay. We didn't celebrate. We didn't occupy. We didn't linger around. We extracted, and we got out with the target in roughly 20 minutes. That's clap your hands, bravo. Netter emphasizes this again and again. The objective wasn't to dominate and, terrorize a territory. It was to end resistance before it could escalate, before it could even start, really. Really. Speed reduces casualties. Speed reduces fallout. Speed reduces the chance of interference. It wasn't chaos, it was completely controlled. The United States Special Forces know what they're doing, so don't buy the narrative that it was just insane. We just came in there and crashed the place and we didn't know what we were doing. We got out lucky and it was just all luck. But here's the part the media barely wants to touch, and it's because it wasn't just about Nicolás Maduro. Maduro was the objective, but the message was the mission. When you line up the guard's account with Netter's analysis, you realize something that's pretty sobering, that this operation, it wasn't designed to be loud. It was designed to be understood by the right people. This wasn't regime change by invasion. This wasn't shock and awe for television cameras. It was a demonstration of reach, intelligence dominance, and inevitability. If you mess with us, if you invite us, we're going to come. The guard said it himself. The most terrifying part wasn't the firepower. It was the preparation. The United States moved like they had already been there, like they had already knew who mattered, who didn't. They knew who they were and how long everything would take. Everything was planned. Netter hammered this point. Modern American power isn't about occupying land. It's about ending resistance before it forms. We don't fight armies anymore. We collapse systems. We'll collapse your communications, your command, your confidence, and then when those fall, everything else falls in line. That's how the operation was fast. That's why it ended so cleanly. And that's why the U.S. forces didn't linger. Lingering invites chaos. Lingering invites escalation. Lingering turns precision into politics. This didn't. The message to the region was unmistakable. Hardened bases don't matter if your systems can be blinded. Leadership can't communicate. Geography doesn't protect you if intelligence already owns the terrain. And here's the part Americans should understand. This wasn't reckless and it wasn't improvised. It was calculated restraint backed by overwhelming capability of the U.S. military. Netter said it plainly. The most powerful weapon used that night wasn't kinetic. It was certainty. The certainty that the target would be reached, the certainty that resistance wouldn't be organized against us, the certainty that by the time defenders understood what was even happening, it would already be too late. That's modern warfare, people. Not bombs falling on cities, not endless deployments, not nation-building disasters, precision, speed, finality in the mission. So when critics argue about legacy or optics or the narrative, that's fine. Those debates, they're going to happen. But operationally, the takeaway is clear. The United States reminded the world that when it chooses to act decisively, we still set the tempo. Maduro's capture wasn't just the removal of a man. It was a reminder to the entire world, to adversaries, to allies, and to anyone who still believes American power is slow or confused or hesitant. We will rock you and bring you home, and we will put you in jail. What happened in Venezuela was precision. It was discipline and control. But what happened in Minnesota, that was the opposite. In Minneapolis, the federal immigration operation turned into a political firestorm after Nicole Good was killed during this ICE encounter, and before facts could even settle, the liberal narrative machine, it kicked into overdrive. There was no questions, there was no investigations, just condemnation, instantly, within hours. ICE wasn't treated as law enforcement, it was treated as an occupying army. Federal agents were branded terrorists. The city leadership didn't calm the public either. They inflamed it. Mayor Frey or Fry, he says, "Get the fuck out," in a press conference on national TV. Streets were taken over. Barricades went up. Police vanished. Protesters ran the block, giving, the winter of love vibes. And here's the part that no one on the left wants to say out loud. This wasn't an accident. It was cultivated. For years, activists and media outlets and all the political left leaders, even celebrities, they train the public to believe that any use of force by federal immigration officers are illegitimate by default, not by question, or they're not reviewable at all. They're just plain illegitimate. So when something goes wrong, even before the facts are known, the mob, they don't wait. It reacts exactly as it's been conditioned to react. Were ICE agents involved? Well, then ICE is guilty. That's the end of the discussion. The women, the two women, or, the woman who was killed, she became a political symbol within a second, not because the facts were clear, but because the narrative was once again useful. Context is erased, legal standards are ignored, the reality of dangerous enforcement work is dismissed, and actual laws are reinterpreted by armchair lawyers and, TV and radio stations and fucking publications. And the media and all this, they don't slow it down, they pour gasoline on it. We witness it every time. They amplify protest schedules, repeat slogans, sanitize confrontations. They downplay violence. They frame barricades as community responses to protect their community. They frame law enforcement as provocateurs for doing their job. That's not journalism. That's incitement with better lighting and a freaking marketing budget. Compare that to what we just discussed about Venezuela, where the U.S. collapsed systems quietly and decisively. Here in America, our own institutions collapse under pressure, optics, and fear of activist backlash. Contrast always matters because the federal agents, if federal agents can't operate inside American cities without being politically sacrificed, if enforcement automatically equals villainy, then we don't have law enforcement anymore. Nobody's going to want to be a law enforcement agent anyways. You're stepping into a position that's massively hated. We have permission structures only when granted permission, which means ICE was granted the permission to enforce the laws that it enforces by Congress. And when mobs decide what laws are allowed to be enforced, the rule of law doesn't even exist. It completely erodes. It dies completely. The streets, they're not where the movement actually starts. It's where it finishes. The real coordination doesn't begin with megaphones and barricades and liberals pounding their chest. It begins in the newsrooms. Minneapolis doesn't just teach activists that chaos works. It taught liberal media outlets that they could act as organizers without consequences in America. In the summer of love, we all remember George Floyd. Look at the pattern. Before protests even form, major networks and publications are already publishing the event time, the rally locations, the marching routes, the slogans, organizing quotes, and their expected attendance numbers even. That's not reporting unrest, that's scheduling it. These the outlets, the news media, they don't wait for demonstrations to happen. They announce them. They create them. They don't observe movements. They activate audiences. They turn activism into calendar items, and then they pretend they're neutral observers when crowds show up and do something that's, out of characteristic of what they want to report. That's not accidental again. That's media creating an infrastructure for these liberals to do whatever the hell they want, basically. Liberal media has become the communications wing of the protest movement. They legitimize it, they sanitize it, and they scale it up. They frame enforcement as provocation. They have a resistance to virtue, and the disorder, it's not mostly peaceful like it's being framed as. When violence or confrontation follow, they wash their hands and say, we're just reporting, We're not coordinating, and we can see all of it, but we're not touching it. If a private organization published protest logistics, talking points, and instructions, we'd call it a mobilization. When the media outlets do it on TV, they call it journalism. We can't call it that anymore. And they call it that because no one has forced accountability yet. But accountability, it's all due. It's overdue. We know that because when journalists act as schedulers or promoters or narrative enforcers, they're the moral referees. I don't think so. They're no longer observers. They are participants. They are choosing a side. And participants don't get to pretend they're blameless when everything escalates. If protests turn hostile, if officers are targeted, if cities shut down, if federal authority collapses or are targeted, then the media that lit the fuse doesn't get to hide behind a press badge. They should be held to the same standards as anyone else who knowingly amplified the disorder. Because when liberal media becomes the front line, when it replaces skepticism with activism, it doesn't just shape the public opinion. It shapes public behavior. That's powerful. That's governmental. That's almost fascist, you could call it. Power without accountability is dangerous, whether it's held by politicians, activists, or journalists. So, to reiterate today, this country still knows how to execute with discipline when it chooses to. We saw it in Venezuela. Precision, restraint, participation, finality, no chaos, no panic, no spectacle. Just competence, doing its job, and leaving when the mission is done. And then we come home. And what we saw here wasn't weakness from law enforcement, it was cowardice from leadership, corruption of a narrative. And it's institutional rot disguised as compassion. Minnesota didn't collapse because of one incident. It collapsed because it's been trained to collapse. Trained by politicians who panic and look the other way instead of, lead correctly, lead with power, lead with ambition. They're trained by media that agitates instead of informs. They're trained by activists who know that disruption gets rewarded and restraint gets ignored. And the most damning truth of all is this isn't an accident. It was predictable. It was repeatable. And it is on repeat. And it'll happen again because nobody in power is paying a price for all of this. And we all see what's happening. When federal agents are condemned before facts exist, when mobs are validated instead of, restrained, when barricades they replace proper policing, when journalists become schedulers and promoters of national protests, it's not dissent. It's a complete failure of the system. And, let's drop the pretense. Legacy media is no longer an observer of unrest. It's the logistic arm of it. They don't report protests. They activate it. They don't describe chaos. They normalize it. And they do not question narratives at all. They enforce a narrative. They tell you what it is, and they make sure that you repeat it. And then when cities burn politically, when institutions retreat, when authority evaporates, they shrug and say, hey, you know what? We're just reporting. No, they're participating. Participation comes with responsibility and accountability. A nation can't survive if the enforcement arm is sacrificed for optics. It's leadership governed by fear, and it's media allergic to accountability. You don't get peace by surrendering authority. You're not going to get justice by mob verdicts. You don't get order by rewarding chaos ever. The lesson being taught right now, loudly and dangerously, is this. If you disrupt enough, the system will fold. If you shout loud enough, you win. And most importantly, if you control the narrative, reality becomes irrelevant. That is not a free society. That's a fragile one. A fragile system doesn't collapse slowly. They freaking shatter. This is the New Conservative Radio Show. I'm your host, NINJ. And this is an outrage. It's a warning. Because the moment accountability disappears, disorder stops being protest and it becomes the policy. So thank you for listening. Like, follow, and share, and stop by 4547blog.com for the 4547 Blogazine Volume 2 or some conservative apparel. And don't forget to join the free blog while you're there. We'll see you next time.